So I have the pleasure of introducing Ahmed Bey. Ahmed did his PhD in the lab in London with Flavio Dell'Acqua back there on all things diffusion, and he mastered the techniques, he mastered all the pre-processing pipeline, and he is our diffusion MR pre-processing wizard. So I leave you in very capable hands for the next hour. Ahmed, take it away.
Right. Thank you, Steph. Thank you, Michelle. And hello, everyone. I can't see anyone, so if there are questions, please feel free to shout, interrupt at any time. Right. So today I'm talking to you about diffusion MRI data pre-processing. And the idea is that, hopefully by the end of the talk, um, we'll be able to go from some diffusion data series, raw data series, to some tractography that looks nice. And the goal in doing so is to deal with everything that comes along the way. So there are many things that come along the way. This is mentioning the main things we deal with during pre-processing. So that's noise, susceptibility, distortions, Gibbs ringing artifacts, motion and eddy current artifacts that affect the data geometrically. And we're going to deal with all of that today and see why they matter. So an ideal data set should give us nice output maps, nice tractography. And if we examine the output maps themselves, we should see smooth transition, hopefully within structures, sharp boundaries between structures. We shouldn't see any sudden fluctuations that aren't explained in the intensity in the image or where we don't expect them. But bad data could be pretty bad. These are some, I guess, more exaggerated examples in some cases, but artifacts can affect data and sometimes in very obvious ways. So these are clear examples of bad data. Artifacts, we can see the first example is really, really clear. But then sometimes the data artifacts can be a little more subtle. So if you just look at the outputs without scrutinizing them properly, you may miss some things. Let's look at the fourth example here, or the second example in the lower row. At first look, it might look like a good map, but then you zoom in a bit more, and then you'll notice that there's this sort of bright band, red band that appears in the frontal region, and that shouldn't really be there. So this is an indication that maybe something went wrong, either at the acquisition level itself, or during pre-processing, we didn't deal with everything properly. So what might a diffusion data pre-processing pipeline look like today, or an analysis pipeline, actually? Well, the first steps are now pretty well managed, I think, by a lot of modern software, data conversion, protocol consistency checks, data organization, and storage. This is what we do when we get the data off the scanner, convert it from DICOM format to an IFTY format. We check that we have everything we need per subject. We'll go through what we need from diffusion in a bit, but the idea is that we're going to check we have all the files that matter. We're not missing any data, and we're going to organize it in a way that's compatible with pre-processing pipelines. Most data today is the goal is to organize it in the BIDS format, which you may already be familiar with, but if not, do familiarize yourself with the BIDS format, because most pipelines nowadays are accepting data organized in this structure. So we've organized the data, then we can go through some early pre-processing steps. Now, early pre-processing will involve dealing with things at the raw data level that we have to deal with at the raw data level before any additional steps have been performed. So these involve things like denoising the data, removing Gibbs ringing artifacts, or any other noise components to the data, like Riceium noise. These are anything noise related in the signal should be dealt with at the very start of the pipeline before other pre-processing steps have been applied, before the image has been manipulated or interpolated through, say, motion correction, which is what brings us to the second step. That's the main pre-processing component. And the main pre-processing component is where we deal with things like geometric distortions in the data. So we're going to look at those in detail as well. motion artifacts because our subjects are going to move in the scanner. Other subtle things like signal drift on some scanners because of scanner heating and other issues. The intensity of the signal over the acquisition series, over the entire diffusion series, might not actually be constant. And we need to deal with that and correct for this drift called signal drift in the data. These are some of the things we're going to correct. We're not going to go into some of those like signal drift correction or gradient nonlinearity correction, because those are quite advanced and they don't apply to all data sets. So what we'll cover today are the main components that apply to every data set that you care about, that you want to use. Once we're done with all of this pre-processing, the pipeline, the data analysis pipeline, will then move toward things like masking, registration to a structural, or if that's already part of the pipeline in some cases, and then your modeling steps, which you're going to cover in the workshop as well separately. So today we're only focusing on this section, and we'll start with the main thing that everyone should care about and correct for, and that's motion processing, because it deals to things that are very clear in diffusion, artifacts that are very clear. So it's not a question of when or if your subject moves, it's a question of when your subject moves. Data is usually acquired over several minutes. In the past, it was a lot longer. In the past, usually it was like 10, 15, 20-minute acquisitions. Now acquisitions are shorter. They're typically under 10 minutes, but the average study will acquire diffusion data for anywhere between like 5 to 10 minutes. So every single volume you acquire, every single snapshot of the brain will consist of, this is an example, 75 slices that are in the axial orientation, and you acquire, say, 60 diffusion volumes in the series, so that you're acquiring 4,500 images, in a typical study. Now, this is improved with some things like multiband, where you acquire several slices simultaneously, but still you're going to acquire thousands of images anyway. And this is for a simple study. If you go for a multi-shell study where you acquire more than one b-value and you're acquiring a bunch of volumes closer to 200, you're talking about 14,000 individual slices. So there will be motion, there will be artifacts. It's not a question of if. We have to deal with this. And the most typical thing we see with diffusion, with motion and a diffusion acquisition, is something called signal dropout. So if you look at this example here, every one of these cells shows us a slice in the same location from the time series. So this would be diffusion gradient 1, 2, 3, and so on. And you notice that this one here is quite low. The intensity is quite low compared to everything else. This isn't just an anatomical feature. This, in this case, is what is called signal dropout, because if the subject moved during this specific portion of the acquisition, we lose the diffusion signal entirely, and that just leads to this attenuation over the entire slice. And this, if not corrected, can lead to very problematic outputs, right? This is, other than the fact that we're misaligning things, we can also see signal dropout. So there's compounding effects, where on one end, we're starting with misaligning the anatomy, and on the other end, we're looking at slices where we're losing signal. And the software tools today are capable of dealing with like really complex ways of correcting subject motion. So this is an example animation from FSL's Eddy tool. And what it's showing you is progression where different features of the pipeline are used. So on the leftmost side, you see the raw data, and you notice that every now and then you have these volumes where there's like this zigzag pattern, or you have bright, low, bright, low, bright, low slices. And that's the effect that you get when the subject moves during that volume's acquisition, when seen on perpendicular to the acquisition axis itself. So we acquired the data in an axial slice, and then here we're cutting through in a coronal or sagittal. So we see the effect where we lose axial slices or the intensity in those slices. Now, if we simply apply the main pipeline and correct for motion, and eddy current distortions, but we don't correct for anything more subtle than this, we still see those effects present in the data. So this data, theoretically, in the second example, has been corrected for the main issues, but within every single volume that we acquired, within the data acquired for a diffusion gradient, that motion is still present, which means that the effect you see at the slice level has not been corrected. Now we can move one step further in the pipeline and include within the eddy command, we can include an option for outlier detection and replacement. So there's an option in the eddy pipeline called repall, which means replace outliers. And that's because these signal dropouts, they're considered outliers statistically within the series. And eddy is detecting where these outliers are. And because the internal model within eddy, or eddy's internal working, is based on a predictive model of the diffusion signal, it can actually generate what the signal should look like based on the redundant information present in the entire diffusion series. So it's pretty useful, and we can fill the gaps where we have them as long as the data quality overall is acceptable. But you'll notice that we still find ourselves with some of these lingering artifacts at the end, where we've maybe filled in some gaps, but there are others that still remain. And that's because ultimately, if the person started the halfway through an acquisition volume itself, so every TR of the diffusion series takes a few seconds, could be 3 to 5 seconds. If within that 3 to 5 seconds, the subject rotates their head, then let's say the first half of the slices were acquired before that motion and the second half after that motion for that one brain volume, then half of the slices are now misaligned with the rest of the slices that we acquired previously. So within the volume itself, we're left with this motion artifact that has misaligned the slices. Think of it as a deck of cards, right? The playing cards. You always do this thing where you want to tuck them all in nicely at the edges, on both edges, right? Because you can have all the cards in a stack, in a pile, but some of them are just sticking out here and there. So what we want to do is like make sure that every card in the deck is aligned with the rest of the deck. And that's what this last step does, the slice to volume correction, where within a single brain volume, slices that have moved or are out of alignment with the rest are also corrected. Signal dropouts don't only affect the diffusion weighted volumes in a series, they also affect the B0 images. These are the ones acquired just without any diffusion gradients or with a diffusion weight of 0. So these B0s can also have these artifacts. They're not as easy to correct as the ones affecting the diffusion volumes themselves, but there are ways to deal with them. And most of the time, unless you're dealing with more special populations like kids or elderly or and patients with difficulty staying still, for most data, the B0s should be okay, but it's always worth checking them and visually inspecting them, because if there's issues like this in the B0s, they should be discarded if not corrected properly. So how does that overall correction work for motion? Well, as we said, we start the series, the subject can move. Every one of these cubes is one volume in the acquisition, so that's one diffusion gradient or B0 image. And we see two sets of arrows on this image. The red arrow will indicate where the diffusion gradient points in that acquisition. So we've applied a different diffusion gradient to every volume, and we're seeing how it looks here. And on top is the nominal vector for that same diffusion gradient called the bvec. This is what we ask the scanner to apply as a diffusion weighting gradient during the acquisition. Now, in the raw data, these two match because we told the scanner acquire this vector, it applied it regardless of where the subject's head was in the scanner, it applied that vector, and then we have them perfectly aligned. Now we go through the first step of our preprocessing for motion, and that involves rotation. So we now rotate every image so that they all look the same. They all point in the same direction, and they're all rotating the same way. Now, the value that we had told the scanner about, and that's encoded in the metadata related to our diffusion acquisition, that's not been corrected at this point. Right? We have a mismatch. Now we've created a mismatch between the nominal vectors and the effective vectors that we applied in the brain. We translate the images so that they all also stack up nicely so that we're comparing the same locations anatomically across time. And the last step we apply has to involve a rotation of the B vector, where these vectors that are stored outside the main data set, they're stored in a metadata file called the bvex file. They also have to be corrected. Now, if you're using most modern tools to do preprocessing, this is included. It's an automatic step, but there are certain things to look out for when you're applying these corrections. So just take note that when you're doing the preprocessing, you want to make sure that the rotation being applied by the software is compatible with the input data to make sure everything's being done correctly. And it's, again, really important to rotate these because if you don't, later on in modeling, you're going to tell the model, I use this vector for the data, but actually effectively, after you've rotated everything, the vector itself is now different in the data itself. And you can see why that matters here. Let's take this example where we have two diffusion gradients. So in green, I'm showing the diffusion gradient that we applied in the scanner, and the red vectors on top, or the red arrows, point to what the metadata looks like, the BVEC. Now, you've seen that if we apply a gradient this way, for example, in the first example on the left, it signals, or where water diffuses parallel to this vector, we will get a signal attenuation. And where water diffusion is perpendicular, like in this part of the corpus callosum, that signal will stay pretty intense. And it's this difference in intensity that we care about when, or that signal attenuation that we care about when we model diffusion. And you see that these two examples were picked because they show this nice contrast in the corpus callosum. Now, if we rotate the images for motion correction, we end up with something like this, where now we have this kind of mismatch between the two vectors. And that's where the most modern software will automatically do this, where they will correct for this thing, where they will basically write a metadata file, a new metadata file called the bvec file that has been rotated properly so that the nominal value is aligned with the effective applied value within the series itself. Now I'm talking about this, but what is a BVEC? In the acquisition itself, the scanner deals with something called a gradient table, and that's basically telling the scanner in which direction to apply every gradient with 3D coordinates. And we specify to the scanner that we also want this B value to be used, and we want this number of B zeros or so on. This is then converted later on to a format called the bvex and bval files. So I'll start just with the bvex first. The bvec file is a file that has 3 lines and has as many columns as you have volumes in your acquisition. So again, in a typical diffusion acquisition where you have, say, 60 diffusion gradients and maybe 5 to 10 D0 images, what you have there is a file that will have 3 lines and maybe 65 or 70 columns. And every one of them is basically telling the software that we're going to use for modeling and for the data preprocessing which gradient was used to acquire volume 1 and 2 and 3 and so on. This is the file that then we need to make sure has been corrected during preprocessing to use the correct output for modeling. And then you have a bvals file, which basically has the same organization, except now you only need one value per volume. So it's one row and as many columns as volumes of the scan. And here it's telling us what the value was used for each volume acquisition. So these two combined, they're separate files. So when you convert your data from DICOM, you will get a nifty file. That's going to be your .nii file, and that's your images. And you'll have a .bvec or bvex file that contains the gradient information, .bval file, that's going to tell you what b value was used per scan, and Nowadays, you also get that sidecar, the JSON sidecar, which tells you all sorts of information about slice times and the scanner information that was acquired. Okay, so subject motion, before and after correction. This is now looking at a more subtle example. So if you just look at this without scrutinizing it properly, um, you might think, well, this doesn't look too bad on the left. Sure, it looks a bit smooth, but I don't see anything major. But then if we look at before and after correction and we play a game of spot the difference, we can spot a few differences. Here's an example where two anatomical structures, probably two gyri, had been more, say, blended, merged before the correction because of the motion effects, whereas after correction, these were separated correctly. We can look at another example in the frontal lobe there. Two seemingly separate anatomical structures before correction are actually not separate anatomical structures after the correction. And similarly, we can look in the back where this primarily green blob, so it seems that the primary direction that we recovered here indicates fibers oriented in the anterior posterior axis. Well, there's a whole gap there of fibers pointing in the superior inferior direction that we missed without the correction. So even if just on average the data seems okay, motion correction, even without these massive differences, is still important because the subtle effects will affect everything you do, including connectivity-derived analyses. Okay, now we're looking at a second huge issue with diffusion, and that's called eddy currents. These are some exaggerated example, but eddy currents or are artifacts that primarily affect diffusion data. More like you don't see them, for example, in fMRI and so on. And eddy current distortions are there because of interactions between the way we do the diffusion acquisition itself and the scanner hardware. So diffusion acquisition involves switching on and off magnetic gradients for the diffusion gradients themselves. And that's a rapid sequence of a gradient on, gradient off, gradient on, gradient off, and so on. And so when we do this repeatedly, these gradients, because they're magnetic gradients, they're going to interact with some other components in the scanner that are metallic, and then they might produce secondary gradients, secondary magnetic gradients that we didn't want to see in the acquisition. We didn't want them to be there, but they're there because of how the interaction is. And that just means that we have these unwanted additional gradients to deal with. Now, these gradients typically are, or the effects that we see from these gradients are primarily observed along the phase encoding direction. So typically, and we'll see an example of that in a second, we're acquiring the data in an anterior to posterior or posterior to anterior phase encoding direction. And that means that the way we'll see these eddy current effects will be along this anterior posterior axis. So the image could be translated posteriorly or anteriorly. We could see a compression or a dilation of the image, or some shearing or skewing of the image, primarily all within this axis parallel to the phase encode direction. And now for a less exaggerated example from real data, you'll see on the left a B0 image. So this B0s do not have eddy current distortions because they don't use diffusion gradients, which means that they are free from these distortions, and we can use them as a reference to know what the real shape should be and the position, what the real position should be. And if we take the contour of this B0 and compare it to uncorrected versus corrected data, you see that the uncorrected image suffers from some of these gaps at the top and the bottom, where it seems that there's some shearing and a bit of compression of the image in this example that we then have to correct for later on. And this is a real example, but this is from data that suffers from slightly heavier eddy current distortions. And in this case, the data is acquired with a phase encoding that is in the left-right direction. So what you see is this wobbly brain, where the brain just dances in that left-right direction. If we had acquired it in the anterior-posterior direction, you might see similar effects where the data just jumps up and down in that axis. So imagine you don't correct for these. Well, what you might get is something like this, where in these locations, you get this kind of characteristic rim, bright rim on FA maps. And that's because in these edge locations, we have now a mismatch where sometimes there's brain data, sometimes there isn't brain data. And that kind of dancing of the brain where we have brain data and not, it means that when we model things, if we haven't corrected for these issues, well, these voxels maybe contain 50% brain data, 50% noise. So what we expect to get out of them is pretty much noise. But although this is a characteristic rim effect, the data is entirely affected by it. Now, within the brain, we see it less because it's still brain data versus brain data. It's just not the same anatomical location anymore. So it's not the same brain data, but we still have the effect everywhere in the image. So this rim is just indicative that the data hasn't been corrected properly. And it's just an indication that the entire thing should be re-preprocessed. So now we look at what a pipeline might look like at this point. We started with raw data. We want to go to fully corrected data for tractography. And at this point, we've primarily covered motion artifacts and eddy current artifacts. Now let's add in another major issue that affects diffusion, and that's susceptibility distortions. Diffusion data is acquired with a type of sequence called echoplanar imaging, or EPI. And EPI is notorious for these geometric distortions. These happen because of interactions between the anatomy itself and the scanner environment, or the main magnetic field in the scanner. And it just means that we think, oh, I'm acquiring data with like 3 Tesla. So every voxel, every location in the brain is experiencing 3 Tesla. Yes and no. There are local interactions that make the magnetic field no longer homogeneous. So these are also called inhomogeneity distortions, because the main magnetic field that we think of as exactly 3T is experienced as slightly different than 3T at different locations. And these effects are pronounced primarily in locations where you have very different tissue types, for example, brain versus air. In the front of the brain and in the inferior temporal lobes, you have these interactions because you are interfacing between brain and, say, air-filled sinuses. You have a major sinus system in the front of the skull, and that's all air-filled. And air has a very different magnetic property than, say, water, which is what we're primarily looking at within the brain. And that difference in the local magnetic properties means that tissue is being magnetized to slightly different extents. And that difference means that we get these distortions in the readout, in the image readout. So these are examples from a data set where, again, the phase encoding direction is primarily in the anterior to posterior axis. And importantly, when I say PA or AP, it's important to specify which one, right? Because these are examples where on the left, we see the phase encoding direction being posterior to anterior, and on the right, it's anterior to posterior. And what you'll see is that the brains look really different. This is the same brain, the same subject, in the same scanning session, no motion between the scans or very little motion between the scans. Why do the brains look very different? Notice the frontal region there is stretched out on the image on the left and compressed on the right. And although we see the main effect there, the effect also exists in other regions. And that's because, again, of that phase encoding direction and the readout that we do. Now, I'm going to show you an example that's sort of a cartoonish illustration of how this process works, just so we could understand a bit more how this works out in EPI. But just bear in mind that this is just for illustration purposes. It's not exactly how things work. We acquire data in the scanner, something called case space, and that's what's being traversed by the sequence. But here I'm showing it as just to kind of drive home the message. And so that's what this might look like in an acquisition. Posterior to anterior, we're traversing the space toward the front, and anterior to posterior, we're traversing it toward the back. Now that up and down kind of traversal of the imaging space or of the frequency space is what causes these distortions, because suddenly if you're going from the posterior end toward the anterior end, you might then start stretching out the signal, or the signal might start leaving away from you. And on the other end, it might go, you're chasing the signal in the opposite direction. And these kinds of distortions, luckily, are more or less straightforward to correct. The good thing is that because we have pairs of images, or we can acquire pairs of images that are distorted in opposite directions, so A to P versus P to A, they experience the same amount of distortion, except that the distortion happens in a different direction. So that's great, because then we can combine the data from the two and derive the distortion field, or a displacement field, that tells us by how much things shift in every location in the image. It's like having a system of two equations to solve for one unknown. So it's more or less straightforward to do. And using this displacement field, we can then undistort, quote unquote, undistort the data according to this degree of distortion, and knowing the exact parameters in the phase encoding direction. So we can uncompress those compressed regions, or compress the distorted, stretched out regions. Now, this is just a pointer about the field map. We estimate the field map early in the pipeline. So usually when we correct the data initially, before we pass it on to some command like eddy that's gonna do motion correction, all of that, we pass a pair of B0 images that we acquired specifically for this purpose to a tool called, for example, TopUp. It's also from FSL. And that tool will derive this distortion field, and then we store that field with our data outputs, and then we pass it on to a tool like eddy that will incorporate the distortion correction step within the motion correction and slice outlier corrections and all of that. So this is also done so we can avoid multiple steps of interpolating the data, because each one of these steps is one that requires data interpolation. So we're stretching or compressing images or so on, which means we need to like re-estimate the exact value per voxel. And doing many of these re-estimation steps will cost something at some point. So the fewer we do, the better. And this is one way we can do that. Okay, now imagine you have data, and that's pretty common, that's been acquired without this pair of images, without the pair of reverse B0 or reverse phase encoding images. How can we do these types of correction for those data? Well, luckily, within the past few years, new tools have emerged that allow us to take advantage of machine learning tools that use the distorted image and T1 weighted image, an anatomical that does not have these distortions, to create a synthetic or fake version of the data that is the same contrast as our EPI, so the same contrast as the B0 image from our diffusion series, just without any distortions. And this is what the main tool we use for this is called SynB0 or SynB0 Disco. And it takes the spare T1 weighted distorted EPI and generates for you a T1 weighted, a distorted and an undistorted version of the EPI that we can then use in the same way we used before, plug it into the pipeline and generate this distortion or displacement field and plug that into the rest of the data. This is really good for legacy data, or mistakes in protocols where sometimes people think they're acquiring a reverse phase encoding B0 image for distortion correction. And when it comes to processing the data, they realize, oh, actually, it ends up being the same phase encoding direction as my main data set. So we basically just acquired one extra B0 that looks exactly the same. We can't use it for that correction. This kind of tool comes in to save the day because, well, we have a T1 at least. Most studies will. So that's really useful. And why do susceptibility distortions matter? Well, because if you don't correct for the susceptibility distortions, what you have is now a mismatch between the anatomy derived from diffusion and the real anatomy that you actually care about, say on a T1 weighted image. This example here shows you where a clear mismatch happens in the frontal region, again, where we see these distortions more pronounced. The corpus callosum in diffusion is now shifted much more anterior than the real corpus callosum from a T1. And by the time you get to the prefrontal or the frontal pole, you see that the diffusion data indicates a location that's now almost an entire gyrus removed from the real anatomy. This is also pronounced in the brainstem, where you see that the pontine region is not properly located with diffusion data. Now, old studies did not do these corrections, but the applications were also more limited, and there was very little integration, multimodal integration between diffusion and, say, fMRI and structural data. So it was maybe a little less severe. The effect of this was less severe. But nowadays, we do a lot of multimodal studies, and it really matters to get things properly aligned. And of course, a really bad example of this would be if you were to use it for neurosurgery, where what you get is, you're planning some study, you want to avoid a certain pathway, optic radiations or corticospinal tract or something, and you're not aware that the location that you got from diffusion is slightly off by a few millimeters from the one you care about, and you end up doing the wrong thing. So these things matter a lot, especially in the modern way of using diffusion and tractography. So now we look back at this pipeline, and we've at this point added motion, eddy currents, susceptibility distortions. Now, sometimes after we've done all of this, some things remain in the data. We spoke about B0 issues where you have this within volume motion that affects B0s that is not easy to correct for with tools that exist in the field. And sometimes you also have remaining artifacts that just couldn't be corrected for, even in the diffusion volumes themselves. So we have some in-house tweaks, and Flavio has worked and written all of these himself. And I think you can ask him these questions in the workshop. But there are some in-house tweaks that allow you to do some post-processing or post-pre-processing, additional pre-processing steps, just to end up dealing with these remaining artifacts in a meaningful way. Okay, now we'll look at some of the other more advanced pre-processing steps for diffusion data. Noise is one of them. We're talking here about thermal noise. Noise affects all types of imaging acquisitions, diffusion and otherwise. And noise is it's just like if you think of it in photography terms and camera terms, if you take a picture with the lens cap on, you should expect to see a completely black image, right? So it's zero in every pixel of your image because there's zero being imaged, there's zero light coming in. So you should see exactly nothing in all the pixels. It's not always what we see. Sometimes we still see some noise in the data, as in there's this kind of salt and pepper pattern to the image. And instead of actual zeros, we see some non-zero values that vary within the image. That's thermal noise, and it's caused by the hardware itself and by the image reconstruction algorithms. Now, you can see its example. I hope it's visible on your end that raw data has a bit of that noise. You can see it's a bit of a grainy type image. And what we want is to remove some of that noise. Ideally, we want to acquire data that has no noise at all, but we can't always remove it in full. And the more noise we try to remove, the higher the risk that we're also going to be removing meaningful signal from the image, because denoising data is a very difficult thing, especially that we don't have a magical thing that says this is just your noise map from the data, just acquired as a separate thing. We have to estimate noise from the data itself. And the estimation has to be done that in a way that balances this noise correction without removing meaningful signal. But this is an example where the denoising is done in I would say, a decent way. We've removed enough noise. There's still some salt and pepper graininess in the image, but it's not as severe as before, and it's a good balance, so we're not losing meaningful information. We can look at what that noise map that we've just estimated looks like. So we see that the noise is not entirely homogeneous within the image. It's higher in the center, lower in the periphery. And that's the most common thing you'll see in MRI because our head coils are closest to the superficial structures, and the center of the brain, where you have the thalamus and the brainstem, that's the farthest from the head coil, from these sensors. So that's the region where we actually end up having the most noise just from thermal noise effects. And you can see that um, the signal to noise ratio map before and after correction has improved quite a bit, especially in the center of the brain. And that's what we're after with denoising. We're just after doing this kind of um, uh, compensation for something that we cannot get rid of in real data. So now our pipeline looks like this. We have noise correction, motion, eddy currents, susceptibility distortions. Another common artifact that we encounter in diffusion is Gibbs ringing artifacts. Now, if we look at two regions, here we're looking at the corpus callosum and the splenium of the corpus callosum, and the splenium sits at the interface, or this is a region where we have white matter from the splenium interfacing with the ventricles. Now, CSF in B0 images, which is the T2 weighted image, have a very bright signal, and white matter has a very dark signal. And this means that when we then reconstruct our image, we might end up with this kind of ringing artifact or oscillation around the interface that creates incorrect higher and lower values than there should be. So if the actual intensity of the image should be around here for white matter and up here for CSF, instead of seeing a nice smooth or sharp transition between them, we see this kind of oscillation at the boundary. And that's called a Gibbs ringing artifact. And there are multiple methods to correct for these artifacts. And you can see what that might do to your data. So in more severe cases where you have bad ringing artifacts without the correction, what you end up with is this sort of pattern where, again, it's really visible in the corpus callosum, so it's a good place to check. You have this pattern where you have bands that are bright, followed by bands that are dark, followed by bands that are bright, and so on. Again, it's that oscillation, that ripple effect within the corpus callosum. And that, if not corrected, ends up affecting not only the diffusion maps that we see, for example, here, fractional anisotropy, but because these maps also mean, because these maps are derived from the tensors, it means that, the tensor itself, our model of the diffusion signal, has now been affected by this. And so not correcting for this means that this is ending up in your diffusion data, in your model, and throughout your entire pipeline. So it's important to check the data. Sometimes the data doesn't have severe artifacts like this. Most data don't have severe ringing artifacts, but it's still worth checking and usually applying some form of these corrections because at some point you will encounter it in your diffusion imaging. And once we've corrected for it, again, these are modern tools that are available for us to correct for these issues. We've recovered the nice smooth transition within the corpus callosum. We've lost this kind of oscillation artifact. And again, it's focusing here on the corpus callosum because it's a very clear example, but this type of artifact exists in the entire brain, right? Again, just like we saw with eddy currents, the rim is an indicator, but the effect is throughout the image. The same applies here. The corpus callosum is a good check, but the effect is throughout the image. So now the pipeline starts to look like this, where we now have noise, Gibbs ringing, motion, eddy currents, and susceptibility distortions. Order matters in the pipeline. Order matters. If you have data that has not been touched yet, and it's really raw data from the scanner, you can apply the full pipeline. You can go from noise to Gibbs ringing to motion eddy current susceptibility. You can do some of those post eddy kind of corrections that we spoke about. If you have already done something to your data, let's say you're dealing with a data set for which you've already done motion, eddy current, susceptibility, and so on, and you're like, oh, I didn't denoise my data. I didn't know about denoising. Let me go back and denoise my data now so I could just improve it. That would be a big mistake because denoising after you've done those steps, after you've manipulated the image, does not work anymore. It will give you just wrong outputs and bad outputs. Even if you don't clearly see it immediately, the statistical properties in the image have now been altered so that the noise estimation, which requires really dealing with the raw signal, is no longer valid. So if you want to do denoising or any of these corrections, make sure you do it at the raw data level before the rest of the pipeline applies. This also is an important point for clinical studies. If you acquire data in a hospital setting or a clinical facility, many times the diffusion series or the diffusion sequence is acquired in a way that well, it's set up to acquire data, let's say at a resolution of 2.5 millimeters in each direction. So you have 2.5 in X, Y, and then slice thickness of 2.5. But then they apply this thing afterwards that upsamples the image within the acquisition slice. So now you will have data that might appear as 1.5 by 1.5 by 3 millimeters. And if you don't know that the data was set up this way, you would think that the acquisition at the origin was done at 1.5 millimeters in each X and Y axis. But that's not the case. That's common for the clinic because these kinds of fancy pipelines are not really applicable for most clinical things. So upsampling the image can help gain a bit more detail within a slice. And for examining things, anatomical structures, this could be helpful. But that means that the image or the signal was already acquired and interpolated or manipulated prior to us receiving the data. And that's already creating a sort of statistical intervention in the signal level that we need to be aware of. So it's always worth checking, how was your data acquired? Was it a clinical facility? Did they apply any such upsampling automatically within the scanner before writing the data output? Keep that kind of thing in mind because it affects what pre-processing pipeline you can use. Okay, so this wraps up the pre-processing pipeline and the steps that we want to cover because this is the main thing. Again, I said there are other steps that you could apply, de-drifting and so on, but that's really a case-by-case basis. Many data sets don't require de-drifting or any other advanced forms of denoising. Now you might ask, how can I do this to the data? Well, there is a tool online or a toolbox online now that's called NBL Tools. It's basically a place where we've put in a bunch of different software utilities, compiled them in a useful command that's quite literally called run all with top up. And it's a way for us to simplify the pre-processing pipeline for most studies. The way it works is you would run the command, you would have organized your data already in the correct way, and you would just switch on which options of the pipeline you want to use. But the tool here is designed in a way to run the entire pipeline, including denoising, unringing, and so on, and just to simplify the process. And to understand what the tool requires and what each option looks like, you can just type in the name of the tool, run Alt U, you hit enter, and then you get the help message that explains what each option is and what it requires. Installing this toolbox, it's available for, well, if you're using a Linux or a Windows machine where you have the Linux terminal, Windows subsystem for Linux, or if you're a Mac user, you can install it as a command line tool. You can clone it from GitHub and then you can download that, install it as a command line tool. And there's online installation instructions, or there's a Docker version that comes with all the dependencies built in. So this tool is is one that builds on other tools in the field like FSL or Ant and so on. So you need to have those pre-installed. And you can see on the website, you could see how to install it, whether you're doing the direct installation or you're going for a Docker installation. And there's some help messages about using it. And that wraps up pre-processing. Let me know if you have questions.